Welcome back to the Demystify Sci podcast. I'm Michael Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today we have Charles Mann on the show. Charles has written some incredible books, the first of which was 1491. The premise is that the Native American populations were nothing like the mythos that we inherited of them, because what occurred prior to the recording of these histories was a massive decimation of these populations by the rapid spread of disease across the countryside and wave after wave of epidemic. And so the remnants, these very dispersed tribal elements, were essentially the post-apocalyptic survivors of something really terrible that had happened. And so when the Westerners showed up, they looked out on the landscape of these peoples and made stories up in order to explain what they saw that imagined that those people had always looked that way. And Charles Mann has a very different perspective on the matter, and the book 1491 really cracks open this case. Our conversation explored not only these ideas, but also there's a deep sense of optimism for what could be in the future in terms of the real environmental threats that we face locally where we live, but really globally in each situation. And it was a very, very exciting conversation in that it stirs up hope, really, for what the future could look like that's not just an apocalyptic Netflix movie. This idea of how we could tailor a better future is really what we're trying to do with this project. The podcast is just one element of that.
Right now we have three pieces of the project. We have the podcast, we have material atomics, and we have investigations. Investigations we haven't been working on too much, but basically the idea is that we're using these three projects as a way of finding the most important and tantalizing and promising pieces of science, engineering, technology, and philosophy that we can use to actually build a better future. And we ask every week for people to come to sign up for a Patreon, and we tell you that we want to be able to do it full time. We tell you that you'll be able to come and hang out with us on the weekends. But really, if you join the Patreon, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be helping us put together a larger project where instead of us taking on the mantle of we have to save the world ourselves and figure out all of the problems and put them together, which is highly unrealistic, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be supporting our effort to fund the projects that we think are the most likely to make the world of tomorrow better than the world of today. And I can't think of anything more meaningful and fruitful than to come together and to figure out what are the problems that we want to solve, to figure out who we want to solve them and how we want to solve them.
And solving them is ultimately a very complex, careful, slow process. We're fundamentally very anti-extremist here. We don't want to just latch on to tantalizing ideas and run with them. We want to really pick them apart, no matter how appealing they might be. And that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do here. And that's what you can join in and help out. Even if you're just leaving comments or hanging out with us on Discord, Facebook, wherever, sharing the podcast with people you think would be good to bring into the fold, giving us guest suggestions, all of these things help us in that goal.
And so come join the Patreon at patreon.com/demystifysci. If you can't do that, just tell a friend. We're happy to have you anyways.
With that, enjoy our conversation. Let us know what you think.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
What percentage of books on the shelves have you read?
Well, define read.
Well, okay, so that's a really good question because we are in the process of writing a book right now, and I have a completist tendency where when I find a source, I feel like I need to look through the entire source in order to be able to earn the right of citation. And I wonder what your perspective is.
I'll give you an example. Where is it? So here's this book here. Okay.
All right.
Which is about, it's sort of a one-volume history of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, what happened after that. right now writing about part of something that happened. There's a 200-year guerrilla war in northern Mexico that spilled into the Southwest and led to the Pueblo Revolt and had all these things that changed the entire history of the West. And so part of this is that the Spaniards got a whole bunch of the groups, the nations in central Mexico to ally with them. And so there was this conquest within the conquest. So it's this extraordinarily complicated thing. And I'm reading it mainly from Mexican and Spanish sources, but I also want to have English language sources so that readers can see them. So I actually haven't, this is pretty good, but I actually haven't read it. I just basically look for the sections in here that would be something that English language people could find and easily read, and then I cite them. And so I probably cite this 10 or 15 times, and there's scattered throughout here each time 5 or 6 pages. But so I'm quite familiar with flipping through it, and I've read intensively, but does that count as reading or just using?
So it's like you found out about some information and then you went and found a good reference for that information that people could relate to.
There's these in this, Mexico has published all these archival documents, just enormous numbers of them, and they've released them on the web, and there are also these collections of them, and you can find incredible stuff in there, but they're in Spanish language stuff that's inaccessible to an awful lot of Americans.
Yeah, how would you even reference that? Yeah.
What?
It's like, how would you even reference an internal document? It'd be a difficult thing for somebody to go and find themselves.
Really complicated. But I want to show you, this is where it is, and I'll tell you how to get there, but it's kind of labor intensive for most people. And I can say, but this is a pretty good history, and these 5 pages cover the same thing.
Yeah, we talk about how strange the art of citation is in some sense, especially when you publish an academic paper. You're really limited by the journal. You get 30, maybe 50 references, and maybe you read hundreds and hundreds of papers, but you have to really buckle down and figure out if you were going to point people to some place they could at least get them in the right direction about some idea, like what would be the next best stepping stone kind of thing.
Right. And then there's these sort of agreed upon weird things where you talk, when you're, at the beginning of the paper, you often talk about what is known, right? For the first couple of paragraphs. And there's these papers that everybody cites, which are just sort of this agreed upon fictive history that may not actually have anything to do with what. But if you actually worm your way through and do the history and write the right people who actually cited it, then a lot of times you'll get, when you send it out for peer review, they'll say, well, wait a minute, what about Schmedlap? That's what everybody cites.
Yeah. It's so funny, yeah. And often, it's so interesting too. There's something it's very much a political game in some sense, that you do have to point to certain people and not to others. That's the other sad part, is some people might have great ideas, but the way they present them is just such a mess, or there's other problems associated with that person, and they don't really make it in the history books for whatever reason. So
so you just, and so, the citations are only loosely, and particularly those kind of connected with the actual, with the actual thing. And then you have this problem. My father-in-law is a physicist, and he is the world's expert in his particular field. And so it's when he has to cite things, it's like he has to cite himself, and he's embarrassed by this, and so he's constantly sort of looking around for other people that he can cite.
What field of physics is he in?
He's in particle physics.
Cool.
He's 98 and just retired.
Whoa!
And he's one of the world's experts in QED, if you guys know what that is. And if you took any of this, that doing things like saying what exactly is happening when an electron is traveling through space is really, really complicated. And the closer you look at it, the more and more complicated it gets, because you have to include more and more things. And so the equations describing that are these these expansions, and they're just enormous things. He's sort of the world's expert in saying what happens when an electron travels through space.
Oh wow, gosh, I'm sad he retired. We should have had him on the show. This is this is one of our pet topics for sure. We've had a lot of really interesting physicists on the show, and of course, my own background is in material physics as well. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic. 98. I don't think we've ever had a 98-year-old on the show.
Right. Well,
that would be pretty cool.
John Moffat
I
was
love my
close.
father-in-law, but he would not be a good interviewer. Extremely shy.
I see. That happens. Yeah.
And I've seen, he's quite eminent, and I've seen people sort of, from the American Physical Society and so forth, and they sort of try and die. And between that, and he's also he immigrated from Japan, and he speaks fluent physics, but his English is a bit choppy, and you add to that being really shy, and you have a difficult interview.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a good portion of the academic community, really the intellectual community in general, that would prefer to just write or just communicate in peer review style, and it's unfortunate because we'd love to talk to a lot of them, but so many people just tell us that they don't really feel comfortable speaking like that extemporaneously. So what can you do?
Right. Well, they have this horror. I mean, the best part of it is, they have a horror of being wrong. And so if you write a paper and you can labor over it and make sure that whereas if you're speaking extemporaneously, you can say something that just makes you want to bang your head against the wall.
Yeah, I guess that's it. But that's also the excitement.
I'm familiar with that, where I've read the transcript of an interview of mine and thought, did I actually say that? And I go back, wow, that was wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the story of our lives to some extent. We're constantly, when we go back to release these and we're going through them, we often cringe at the things we say. But hopefully that drives us towards saying less stupid things in the future, and you sort of learn this way. But man, I'm really, really, really excited to have you on the show today. This is 1491 was such an important book for me. Actually, my dad found it for us, which is shout out to my dad. He's kind of a no nonsense enthusiast about history, and he was like, "This book is absolutely amazing. You guys have." I think he bought us a copy of it.
He did,
actually.
yeah. We still have it on the bookshelf.
So yeah, maybe you can just crack open that book and maybe introduce the basic premise of it. I guess I could do it, but maybe it'd be cooler if you let us know how you would explain it to somebody who hadn't read it before.
This is, I always, if occasionally I have to give talks, and I would always say, listen, I'll spare you reading the book. Here's the basic thing.
Yeah.
When I went to school, and when most people my age, and actually even my kids went to school, what they were taught about the first 15 or 20,000 years of history of the Americas was that, Indians, with quotes, came across the Bering Straits 12,000 years ago. They existed mostly in small, scattered bands, and they had so little impact on the environment that when the Europeans arrived, most of the Americas was, for all intents and purposes, a wilderness. I guess one way to summarize my book, which is attempting to summarize the last 30, 40, 50 years of research in anthropology, historical ecology, archaeology, botany, the historical botany, there's a bunch of genetics, so forth, is that all of these are probably wrong, that Native people were here for far longer than previously believed. They're here in far greater numbers than previously believed, and they had much more impact on the environment than previously believed. And the rest is all details.
So it's sort of circles around the fact that we were all given the impression of what the Native American communities looked like based on the fact that people were showing up to something like a devastated civilization in the first place. And you point to the fact that disease had perhaps wiped out some overwhelming preponderance of the population, and what was left would be something akin to if there was an apocalypse today and all you had left was a bunch of, I don't know, rednecks out in the woods or something. People, the toughest last remnants of these people were left, but the civilization itself was already greatly diminished. And so the vantage was skewed in the direction of extrapolating that population to the entire civilization as a whole.
Yeah.
You know, it's really funny because we have talked about your book on this show a lot, and it's a little intimidating to be sitting in front of you to now be like, do I remember this? Do I have this right?
Yeah. And the second thing that happened is that the sort of template for like history textbooks and so forth was set more than 100 years ago. And in fact, Frances Fitzgerald wrote a wonderful history of history textbooks, 40 years ago. And one of the things that she points out is it's incredibly hard to change them. These narratives, get set. And at the time that they're writing the textbooks was a real nadir for Native people in the Americas in just almost every possible way. And it was very hard for historians and sort of common people who were not Native at the time to look at these people who had, been systematically treated terribly for just a tremendous amount of time and go back to what they had been, because the temptation is always to think, well, they're always like this. And so you have this combination of people coming to the Americas, Europeans coming to the Americas, often to places that had been, devastated, as you said. And then when the accounts that we are taught are set, it's at this population and cultural nadir when, there's programs being set up essentially to try and get rid of Native tribes once and for all. Put those together and you have a pretty potent combination.
Yeah. When did you start putting this together in your head? Is this some vision that you've nurtured for a really long time before you wrote the book, or what drove you?
Yes and no. First, I want to make clear, what I try to do in that book is to put together a lot of other people's work and say, look, there's a pattern here. So I'm reporting on this. And so all this is, I hope on a solid bedrock of decades of really great work by archaeologists and anthropologists and historical ecologists and botanists and geneticists and so forth. And then my own personal part of it is I grew up in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, not far from the Tulalip Reservation. And you can just go into museums in the in Victoria and Seattle and so forth, and see just absolutely spectacular art that even as a kid I thought was just absolutely amazing. And so this whole sort of idea that these folks were patsies who got wiped out seemed strange to me. And in addition, in the Northwest at the time, there was a huge fight over salmon. There's a treaties signed in the 1850s that guaranteed I think there's 28 tribes that were affected, the rights to hunt and fish in their, I think the language is usual and accustomed grounds. And the state had spent decades trying to, prevent that. And so Native people were, next door to me, so to speak, were getting arrested for things that my neighbors were, white neighbors were not getting arrested for. And it just, and there was this big protest that was quite effective. And so growing up, seeing this protest and seeing the art, I had this idea that there was, something that these are really interesting and important people. And then, after college, I went to, I lived in Italy for a couple of years for unrelated reasons. And then I went to Yucatan, the Yucatan Peninsula, and saw Maya ruins for the first time. And I was just absolutely blown away. and just astonished at the size and extent of them, and to my at least untrained eyes, sophistication. And I thought, geez, this is strange. I don't think we should learn about Greece and Rome, and I did, but I don't think the word Maya was even mentioned, in my high school. And it seemed I couldn't understand why. It was my own hemisphere. And then about the same time, I learned, really pretty much by chance about all this new findings in the Amazon. And so, I don't know, in the early 90s, I thought somebody should write a book. And this was before the internet, right? And so I was convinced that somebody had. So I would go to bookstores and say, hey, and I would describe this book I wanted to read. It's about the whole hemisphere, and it's about all these new findings. And the bookstores would say, oh, wow, that sounds like a good book. Nope, don't have it. Nice. And finally, after years, I thought, well, if nobody else is going to do it, I'll take a stab at it.
Was it difficult to start doing the research?
I kind of had done it already. When I went to the Maya realm for the first time in the early 80s, by chance, it was the time when there's this extraordinary intellectual effort to decipher the Maya written language, where there is this mix of native Maya speakers and archaeologists who got together, and they had this thing in Palenque every year, and it was an incredible intellectual effort. If I can be on a soapbox for a second, normally when you decipher an ancient language, you have a crib, like the Rosetta Stone, where you have the same text in several languages, one of which you don't know, and you can use the known languages as a reference. Well, there wasn't anything like that. And so they had to figure it out just by pure smarts. And it was an incredible effort, because the written language is so different and so forth, but they did it. And so this was all ongoing, and I reported on it for Science. And there's also at the time political movements of first Maya language radio stations going on, a lot of restive stuff that eventually led to these big confrontations in Chiapas and the southern part of Mexico with the Zapatistas and all that. That's all basically Maya people standing up. And so I had done that, and I had also reported on some of the stuff in the Amazon when I heard about it. And so I had begun doing that. And it was, once I got my feet wet, it was exciting and interesting the way, once you get excited and interesting, it doesn't seem like hard work to try and find out more.
And so when you began to research, had the academic tide started to turn to a new version of events, or was it still kind of okay? And
so a big event was in the 1960s, a guy named Henry Dobbins, I think he's passed away now, began sort of re-examining the question of native numbers, of native populations. And at the time, there was this idea that there was maybe just a few million people in the Americas, at the time the Europeans arrived. And he said, wait a minute, if you have a single epidemic of untreated smallpox kills like up to 50% of the people involved, and you had these repeated epidemics, and if you end up with a few, the Spanish censuses and so forth, and you end up with a few million people, and you had diseases that kill 80 to 90% of them, you have to multiply that number by an order of magnitude. And he wrote a couple of articles in a book, The Numbers Have Thinned, that were like bombs, thrown into archaeology and anthropology, because he made this sort of very strong maximalist case and said at the end that there might be as many as 110 million people in the Americas at the time of that the Europeans arrived, and set off a huge furor in the field. And I think it's fair to say that most people think that he went too high, but that the impact was for people to say, wait a minute, there's 40, 50, 60 million people who are here. And that's just incredibly different than, say, 5, both in terms of what you need to have a society of millions of people and the impact that they're going to have on the environment.
And the ability for specialization and different roles.
Yeah.
It's funny because I think these numbers are still going up. We had the privilege of having these two archaeologists from Tulane on the show last week, and they work with the ancient Mayan cities as well. And that was one of when we asked them what are the biggest things that are changing in your field, and they were like, well, the size of these populations has just continued to go up and up and up. And another thing that they mentioned too, one of their main theses that we've been just kicking around a lot that I think really reinforces what you're saying is that they pointed out that a lot of what we think of as the Maya today were these peripheral villages. The descendants of those villages are from villages, and they were always more or less in those villages, whereas the actual cities that were populated and metropolitan, those people seem to have been completely eradicated. Like they died. They're gone. A lot of their language didn't persist.
Yeah, it was a linguistic analysis at its foundation, because if you study the languages from the peripheral tribes, there doesn't appear to be any evidence of the language that was spoken in the cities and carved on the buildings.
Right.
And the gods and everything.
Right. And they probably told you about the LiDAR findings. In fact, I'm sort of gathering stuff for the, to do a new edition for 1491, which I hope would come out next year. And one of the sort of shocking things is that in the last 3 years or so, they've discovered not just sort of new stuff about, previously known things, but just a little while ago, they found this incredible, entire gigantic urban complex that's, 100 kilometers long, with these enormous highways. I mean, just crazy big highways, up to 120 meters. No, it was up to 40 meters wide, and they're made by a kind of cement. So they're causeways through this. So they're on these big cement blocks that go for many, many miles. And there's this network of them in the northwestern part of Guatemala that was just previously unknown. And it's dazzling to think about what is required without, contemporary technology, without horses, to build 110. I think it's 110 miles is the right figure, but many, many miles of raised causeways through the forest out of gigantic cement blocks.
Well, you at least need a really effective bureaucracy, right? That's what's so astounding to me is the compartmentalization.
Mobilizing labor for that is amazing. And then feeding all those people and getting water to all those people. It's really, not a small endeavor.
Right. And I think we think of our society as being so advanced because we do have these technological achievements. Like we have cell phones and computers and spaceships, but at its heart, our society is really this stratified, rich interchange of people who have specialized skills, and we're organized by bureaucrats, and there's lawyers and doctors, and so much of that seems to have necessarily been present in these ancient civilizations. Right. And that's the piece of the Native American story that it's very hard to overcome that in your mind, at least for me, having grown up in America with the history books as they were at the time. And I still find myself struggling to reimagine the civilization being this very complex network of professional people and, not just what's being portrayed in Hollywood or in the history books.
Right.
It's such a difficult thing to overcome.
Right. And then you had, the other part is that it was enormously diverse because, the societies of the Northern Plains were, radically different from the societies of the Southwest, who in turn were quite different, and the Maya, who are in turn quite different from the people in the peoples in the Amazon. And so, and the thing I think it's really important to say is that these societies are very old, and they're all sophisticated but in different ways. Each society, to me, I think I would capture is it represents an experiment in how to be human. How to govern yourself, how to have relations with other humans, and so it's one of the exciting things for me about this is getting a peek on these people who have, if you run the tape backwards, have made slightly different choices that have led to really different outcomes, and some of which have, I think, something that we can learn from.
At the beginning of 1491, there's this anecdote, or there's this story of a ship arriving before Columbus and not being able to make landfall on the East Coast because the settlements are so dense.
It was just after Columbus. It was, but yes, they were there, and these Europeans are coming there. The settlements are so dense, and they're sort of going, yeah, I'm not sure about this, because the ships, then we think of them, as being kind of essentially like our ships, which are these big things full of people. But, Columbus is, 3 ships had together fewer than 90 people on them. The biggest was 60 feet long.
Yeah, there's a replica in my hometown. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and there's a replica of the Santa Maria there, and it's like a big rowboat, basically. It's unbelievable.
And so it's very sensible. If you're, in one of these very small ships to sort of, and you see a settlement of several thousand people who are looking very hostile, for you to sort of draw back and think like, maybe I'm not going to do it.
Maybe we'll let somebody else with bigger guns take care of this one.
Yeah.
But they came back a few years later, and those settlements were decimated.
Yes, and that's one of the things that you hear over and over again, especially in North America, is that diseases spread. And the thing that you're, I think, thinking of is that the first epidemic that we know of in New England, which is where I'm speaking you from, was in 1616. There's a shipwreck. And there's some apparently French, and there are some sailors there who the Nauset, I think it was, made the mistake of not killing, and they had some kind of disease, and it spread throughout that Cape Cod region, and along the coast of Massachusetts, and a bit into Buzzards Bay, and that gave, a few years later, the Pilgrims, on the Mayflower, an opening to come in, and they literally settled on top of a deserted Wampanoag village. And in fact, that's how they survived, insofar as they did survive that first winter, was by robbing native graves, which had food in them. And
that didn't make it into the Thanksgiving myth. Come on.
No. The whole thing is, I guess you could say, as a person, I'm actually like the waspiest person you're ever likely to meet. I literally had ancestors on there. I could belong to one of those organizations, whatever they are, the Daughters of the American Revolution, maybe. I can't remember what I guess I'm not Mann, but but one of those. Anyway, they, if you think about it, they arrived in New England 6 weeks before winter with hardly any food. Like, what's up with that? And it's, when you think about it, it's sort of amazing that only half of them died.
Mm-hmm.
That's incredible, actually.
And so, I mean, to show up to a place where there's a deserted village and you're robbing graves in order to survive the winter, is there much evidence of how they were processing that you came across when you were researching? Yeah,
I mean, they wrote about it. I mean, they talk about this, but it was like, what are we going to do to survive? This was really, really a dark time for them, and they had kind of burned their bridges behind them. It was going to be very hard for them to return, both because the ship probably wouldn't have made it. Actually, the ship went back, but with all of them, it wouldn't have made it. There wasn't enough supplies, and partly because they wouldn't have been welcome, back in England and in London, so far as we know. So they had to make this work, and if that included robbing graves and so forth, well, they were heathen graves, right? They were they're not Christian graves, so probably not as they probably didn't feel quite as bad.
Do you have a sense of what the exact disease was that swept across the countryside in that time
That one,
period?
that one. Well, I mean, nobody knows, right? There is a historical epidemiologist up in Maine. I've forgotten his name. I'm embarrassed to say, who has argued in print in a scholarly article that it was viral hepatitis, and which is transmitted by water and and excrement in water, and so that would have killed people. And as far as we know, didn't exist in the Americas before because relatively small number of people came over from Asia, and they didn't bring a lot of diseases with them. It's pretty cold up there, and so there's so very few communicable diseases were in the Americas at the time of Columbus. And one of the points that I try to make in the book is that the first 150 200 years after Columbus is like if all the suffering and death caused by all these diseases in Europe and Asia and Africa have been compressed into that period in the Americas. And so you had this absolute wave of disease, smallpox being probably the worst, but also measles, hepatitis, mumps, these parasitical diseases, bilharzia, and so forth. Just a whole parade of them came. And it's from our days difficult to disentangle them all.
Yeah, were there waves of disease coming from the West Coast too? 'Cause I believe there were Spanish and Portuguese explorers on the West Coast as well.
Yes, and the big one. There's a wonderful book called Pax Americana by Elizabeth Fenn, and really first-rank historian about this enormous epidemic that in the 18th century that swept up from Mexico City, and the horse had been introduced and was able to carry it long. People on the horse were able to carry it long distances and spread up all the way through the plains, came to the Pacific Northwest, hit the northern plains of Saskatchewan, and even into the Great Lakes, and just caused horrible stuff everywhere.
And we're talking about, what kind of percentages are we talking about of the population getting wiped out by these in the
really
worst case scenario?
It's really difficult to know because we don't have censuses then, and the idea of a census, even for many of those societies, just wasn't something you did. You didn't count people in that way. You didn't maintain,
let alone ask who was there 20 years ago or whatever.
Right. So what we do know is that in Asia there were record keeping in Southeast Asia and South Asia in particular for smallpox and untreated smallpox, typically according to Indian and I think they're Thai, I'm not sure, records, is about 40% of the people, of the adults that it gets. And so that's a ballpark figure. So say because you reduce it to 30%, that's still just an absolutely devastating loss. I mean, look at the U.S. We have this COVID, which has a fatality rate way, way lower. And it caused massive upheaval and political instability and all this sort of stuff. Now imagine, something that's more than 10 times worse.
Yeah, that was one of the things that scared me so bad about the pandemic, is thinking how mild this was and how much it almost brought our civilization to its knees.
Yeah.
And just thinking, gosh, what if we actually face something legitimately terrifying? I mean, obviously lots of people died and that's tragic, but it could get so much worse, it seems like.
Yeah, no, I lost some family members to it, and it, rocked my family, and then you multiply that by everybody, and much, much worse. And then you also saw, when these devastating events happen from these invisible agents, people come up with all kinds of explanations for what is they think is going on, that aren't necessarily, based in science or logic or anything like that. And so, and you're always looking to point the finger at something. There's blame that's try people assign, whether it's to Asian people or to the CDC or whoever you want to blame for things. And so you imagine all these societies in which just get wanged and all these human effects come in, and you end up with it's just a shattering event. And it's really remarkable to me that the Native societies in the Americas are as intact as they are, given what happened.
Yeah, is there a
There's an
sense?
incredible story of resilience there.
Yeah, is there a sense of what permitted them to maintain the resilience? Is it just the opposition to the oppressive force that's coming in that gives them the rallying point, or is it something else?
Well, I think it was probably different for different societies. I mean, you're dealing with, and I'm sure that resistance was helpful. And then there is also larger and smaller ones, and so the Maya, there's still millions upon millions of Maya, and they're never going to go away. And similarly, you have 250,000 Choctaw or something like that. There's more now than there were then, but they when you have this pool of people, you can rebuild. What's really remarkable to me is when these sort of smaller scale societies often would just have a few people that would pull things together for everybody. And wow.
Yes, I forget who it was, but someone mentioned to me the other day that at least certain Native American populations today are actually making some incredible gains in terms of owning their own resources and actually having a pretty reasonable shot at something approximating a state of their own in the future. And
the movement is for, I mean, the word that you hear a lot is sovereignty. And most, maybe all, I'm not really sure, of the treaties that were signed, which under the Constitution have, really the force of federal law, specify that the Native governments have the right to rule themselves. And a lot of these treaties have not been observed. And you can think of, all these many protests from Standing Rock to the the stuff in Canada over the boarding schools to lots of stuff happening in California as efforts to claw back the sovereignty that they had been guaranteed, and the efforts have been by and large really successful. I wrote a little piece about this for National Geographic last summer, and it's just remarkable how they're reclaiming their lives in these different ways, ranging from reestablishing, because sovereignty is more than just self-rule, although that's what it means. It means something like free to live your life, in accordance with your own values. And that includes, your own food, your own games, the landscape around you, a whole host of things are implied by that.
Yeah, I think there's a broader pattern that plays out that is beginning to appear to me, which is cyclic with civilizations, in the sense that our civilization today can be looked at as an extension of the Greco-Roman civilization. Our legal buildings, our courthouses still bear the same architecture. Our legal documents are written in the Roman language to some extent. But there was this really dark period for like 1,000 years where not much was happening. And the Roman Empire disappeared. And it's almost like it's making a resurgence. And I think that a lot of civilizations go up and down. The same thing could be said about the Canaanite civilization and then the return of the Jewish people to Israel and rebuilding on that site. And it's almost like these peoples, if they can hang together long enough, will be able to eventually rebuild a city, or not even a city, but a whole metropolitan universe. And it's like, you can almost imagine a future in which the Mayan people are actually a metropolitan force again, if that continues to play out on the long scale.
Yeah, and it happens in different ways. You probably know that there's efforts to bring back the buffalo, all over the West, and there's a international buffalo treaty between, I don't know, 60 or 70 native nations, both in the U.S. and Canada, and the collective herd they have is the largest herd of free roaming buffalo that there is, and they are building these. There's negotiations now to take the Blackfoot Reservation, which is in Montana, on the east side of the Rocky Mountains, and Glacier, which is right next to it. Glacier National Park was carved out of the reservation, and then there's a corresponding Canadian National Park, I think it's called Waterton, just to the north, and some Blackfoot reserves there, and to put them, sort of amass them all together into this enormous, buffalo commons. And I think they would like to add the Yellowstone ecosystem, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, to that with the there. And then there's some very large reservations there as well for the Wind River Reservation in particular. And you would have just a huge area, that would be essentially an attempt to bring back the buffalo grasslands ecosystems that were there, until a couple hundred years ago. And that isn't the same as building a metropolitan, but to the people of the Blackfoot and the Shoshone and, and the Cree and the others, this is the same, it has as much resonance.
The nature management side of things. I'm
Yeah.
not sure what the term is for that. But yeah, they must have collaborated. They must have at least had some collaboration amongst the different tribes and peoples to cover that much land, which would be necessary to sustain such an enormous population.
Yeah. And so you had, back then, I think the social science term for it is shared sovereignty, which is that, if you look at the maps of the land that is claimed to be, Lakota land or, Blackfoot land or Shoshone land or Cheyenne land or whatever, they all overlap. And so, and that there's certainly a certain amount of jostling, but it also meant that, we would have rights to bison here. You could come here afterwards for the berries and the other resources. And so you had these people doing this kind of intricate dances, if you like, these annual circuits around the landscape, all rather carefully negotiated.
And this ties into a lot of what you were talking about in 1493, right? The sort of the ecological changes that happened in the aftermath of the arrival of the Westerners, and the way that fed back into the old world, and the drift of what a natural landscape looks like. And so this seems to be kind of continuing the story that you started to tell there.
Yeah. So I guess I should mention to your audience that I wrote, a second book called 1493, which is about what happened after, 1492, and the great historian Al Crosby invented this term, the Columbian Exchange. And what he was either the first or one of the first to notice was that, if you think about it, 200 million years ago, the Earth consisted of a single giant landmass, scientists call it Pangaea, and geological forces broke it up, and forever, for tens of millions of years, separated the hemispheres. And so for tens of millions of years, there's almost no traffic between the Eastern and the Western hemisphere. And then Europeans arrive, and there's this ecological convulsion as huge numbers of species from over there come over here, and huge numbers of species from over here go over there. And it's the biggest event in the history of life since the death of the dinosaurs. And it was, we're still living in its ripples. And so that's why, you can go to the Middle West and see enormous areas covered in soy and wheat, which are neither of which are native. Or you can go to Northern Europe and have polenta, right, and which is from corn, and tomatoes, and in China you can go on the streets, and a very popular snack is sweet potatoes, and these all had impacts not just on diet, but on societies in a very deep way. And so part of 1493 is about when the sweet potato is introduced to China. One of the things, if you look at a map of China, that makes it very different from someplace like North America, is that there's hardly any water in China. China has something like 20% of the world's people in it, and something like 8% of the world's above ground fresh water. And also not great on the aquifer side. And so the whole western part of China is really, really dry. And what happened is American crops came in, the sweet potato first, then later the potato, and made it possible to start cultivating these regions, and caused enormous ethnic conflict as they moved into these dry hills, and led to these areas being cultivated for the first time. The hills are made out of, particularly in the northwest, are made out of loess, Loess, the piled up silt, from blowing up the Yellow River. And this caused massive erosion, which led to these catastrophic floods in the 19th century. If you go to Wikipedia, and they have a list of the worst floods. There's an amazing number of them that are in China in the 19th century. And led to enormous political instability in the Qing regime, and to things like the Taiping Rebellion, where 20 million people died, and so forth. And so you have these incredible shin bone connected to the leg bone type knock-on effects. You bring the sweet potato in, and you end up with a revolution. This happened all over the place. And the big story for people like me of European descent is that when American crops came in, particularly the potato, there's a big belt across Northern Europe from Ireland all the way into Russia and Ukraine that got sort of taken over by potatoes. And potatoes are much more productive in general than wheat. If you think about wheat, it's a little long, skinny stem with a thing on top of it. And so if it gets to be too much grain on top, it falls over, becomes top heavy, and that's called lodging, and it kills the plant. And potatoes, by contrast, and tubers in general, all the good stuff is underground. They can just grow and grow and grow, and has no impact on the plant. And so with 18th century methodology, which is because we're talking about the 18th century, it's possible to grow 4 or even 5 times as much food per acre. And if you would read these, classic histories, like the ones by Fernand Braudel of Europe, they are always talking about how there's these terrible famines, and there's the mob, which in Daniel Defoe's MOBB, and there's granaries with armed guards and this sort of stuff. And Braudel showed that there is a sort of a major continent-wide famine about every 10 years for 300 or 400 years there. And then the potato comes, and then corn, which is also more productive than wheat, in the south, in Spain and in Italy. And suddenly Europe is able to feed itself. And that's when these empires take off. They have the resources to do it. And so these are the American crops are, as I think as Braudel put it, are the fuel that fired the European empires.
Reading all this history, do you start to get a sense of determinism and inevitability, or are you struck by the suddenness and strangeness of the events that sum to create the modern world?
More the latter. You just I just think like you're reading, and I'm sort of constantly surprised by things that happened. The in the thing I'm working on now, there is this whole series of, I think it's just a couple paragraphs in the book. I've just been reading and just agog about how Spanish religious festivals were taken up in all throughout Latin America. And there's this festival called the Festival of the Moors and Christians that started in, like the 12th century in Spain and is taken up and is performed now. Like I've seen one in rural Brazil, is formed in Zacatecas and places like that. And the meaning of it has been completely turned upside down, so that these things showing where Christians are beating Moors, the Moors are always played by people in costumes that represent conquistadors, and the Christians are always dressed in native garb. And so it's a festival, this reputatively Christian festival, which is all about the glory of Spain, has actually been transformed into this festival of a fantasy of kicking out and killing all the Spaniards.
Wow.
You think like, whoa. And they go on in Zacatecas every year in the last week of August, and 20,000 people are there, primarily native background, cheering on these Christians who are not Christians as they kill Moors who are not Moors. And you just think, how did that happen? It's just completely wild. And anyway, it's a small thing, but I was just struck by how weird that was. And you see that again and again, in if you read about history, how these odd things pop up and then become really important.
Yeah, I think it was a similar case with music in the slave America in the South as well, with, the only chance that those people who were brought over had for celebrating was if they adapted to, I think that's really where like Southern gospel music came from, is you're like, okay, well, if we just sing about the Bible or whatever, we can just do our traditional thing. We just have to pretend like we're doing it.
Right.
And at some point it just becomes, mixed up to the extent that they're inseparable.
There's a text and there's a subtext, and the subtext in these festivals in Mexico and Brazil is like really glaring.
It's like not even trying anymore.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. But they do claim that, but they're I guess the dialogue still expresses the fact that it's Christians and Moors fighting.
Yeah. No, it's Christians and Moors, and when the one I saw in Brazil, I haven't seen the one in Zacatecas. I was reading about it, thinking like, God, it'd be so cool to go there. I said, wait a minute, these Christians, they're all dressed in, African and native costumes. And the people are, oh, wow, we never thought of that. Oh, really? Geez. Okay.
Yeah, how much, Yeah, nothing going on here. But how much did you travel in your years researching these ideas? Did you speak with people who were descendants of these indigenous peoples and kind of present your perspective? And
I think that's probably one thing that differs, reporters and academics is, this is a gross generalization, and it's really easy to find exceptions. But I think it's true to say academics, particularly historians, tend to look for documents and written things, and they're obviously super important. Reporters tend to go and try and talk to people, and they both have faults. Both have types of holes, and often reporters rely too much on talking to people, and historians rely too much on this. But you have, I was really surprised. There's quite a good book by a guy named Hamalainen about the Comanche. It's really an interesting book. It's called The Comanche Empire, and it's really quite a deep study of these folks. And the Comanche I talked to liked it as well. But they said, it's so weird. He never comes to talk to us. And I thought, he doesn't, hang around like, no, he had never been there.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, that's really weird. He did a good book, so don't. But I do think he would have benefited from going there.
What do you think the benefit would have been? I mean, I think
Sorry?
I said, what do you think the benefit would have been? I mean, I inherently agree with you that the person who's writing about a certain subject would benefit from the visit.
Okay, so I'll give you a small example. So he called his book. It's right here. Actually, I'll show it to you. And I want to stress that it's a good book. Here it is, The Comanche Empire.
Nice.
Happens to be right above the my computer. Anyway, you notice that title, Empire, and he's in Oxford. Hamelin is the professor there, and for people in Oxford, empire is like a unit of analysis. It's a type of government, and there's a bunch of folks in Oxford who think that that's sort of the natural. Most ways that people govern are in these empires, which coercively bring together all these different groups. And so it's not a term of opprobrium, right? Whereas for a lot of Native people, empire goes to imperialism, which has made their lives miserable. And they're saying, wait a minute here, are you really, what are you talking about? This is, are you saying the Comanche are just the same as the Spaniards or the English empire? And in a certain way, Hamelin would say, well, yes, it's an abstract unit of analysis and so forth. But I think if he had gone to Comanche territory and talked about empires, he would have gotten some looks, right? And it would have, maybe he would have written about what he was doing in a different way. As it was, when the book was published, he got some pushback for that.
It's so interesting how speaking the truth is not sufficient. Like, it doesn't, like, there's so many different contextualizations of any statement of fact, and the way that they're delivered really determines whether they're embraced or disregarded. So many of the different theories that we examine on this show even haven't maybe seen the light of day that they deserve, perhaps just because they're not presented in a context that's easily integrated into, the readership. And in this case, if you're missing the native population, you're missing a big part of your potential readership, it seems like.
Well, in particular, this is, sort of part of all that mishigas about cancel culture and that sort of stuff. But the way I think of it, in particular for this particular subject, is that there's a lot of writers, who don't realize that the people they're writing about are in the room. They're part of the audience, and I might talk about my family to you, who's not a member of my family in a certain way. But I would, if my sister was right here, I would talk in a way that acknowledges her presence. And I would probably, use slightly different language. I would like to think that I wouldn't say different things, but, how I couched whatever I did would have some respect for the fact that she was in there. And so in this particular area, it's a matter of really not realizing who's in the audience. And I think it was a fair assumption, 30 years ago, that if you wrote a book about history and it touched on indigenous people, you could sort of say, oh, they're probably not in the audience. But now that's no longer true. And it's much better for them to be in the audience. This is not a complaint.
How have you navigated those waters? Because you're kind of telling these stories of the tribes and of their relationship to the conquest and everything that's happened afterwards. So how have you taken care to bring people into the room?
Yeah, well, the discussion here makes me uncomfortable because it's a little bit like, why am I doing such a good job? How come I'm so great, right? And,
or maybe you could look at it a little. You could look at it just like how would you tell a young investigator to go about including something like that? You don't have to necessarily blow your own.
I mean, I ask this from the perspective of someone who is in the midst of writing a book, and I want to be able to understand the kind of craft and attention that goes into writing a book of such depth and quality.
Oh, geez, this is making me feel really even better. Okay. I guess, so one thing that I see quite often, and is that if you're writing something, you want to think about who is sort of that the way I experience reading something is like having a little voice in my head. It's a little bit like having a conversation with somebody, except that person is droning on and on and on. I don't get a chance to say a word, but and so I think about how am I projecting myself, and for me it's important not to put myself above the reader, and not to put myself above the people I'm writing about, to try and say I take them seriously. And I'll give you an example. There's another book about the Comanche, since we're talking about the Comanche, that is also quite well known, and they don't like as much as Hamlin's book. And so I said, why? And then I read it, and it was clear. This writer is talking about how the Comanche accurately, were this amazing opposing force to the expansion of the U.S. for, 150, 200 years, that they stopped. And there's a reason that in Comancheria, which is the Comanche area, is in eastern Texas, and there's no railroads that go through there, and it's because the Comanche wouldn't let them. They had this impact, and so he's talking about how the army just hated them, and so forth. And he said the Comanche, this writer says, were stopping the advent of civilization.
Oh no!
Yeah, and it was because the writer had forgotten who was in the room. And
who's civilization?
Comanche read this and go, wait a minute. And we think of ourselves as, we don't think of you guys as civilization, we think of us as civilization, right? And it's so easy to fix that, really, to say, from the point of view of the U.S. military, the Comanche were stopping. The writer had forgotten who was telling the story, and had allowed the U.S. military for a few sentences to sort of take the role of narrator. And so that's what I try to think about, which is who's telling a story here, and what are the assumptions of the person telling the story. That's a pretty windy response, but it's really what I think about.
No, it's really interesting. Do you imagine who is the person that you're talking to when you're writing? Just now that we're kind of getting into the craft of writing a book, I'm just very curious. Do you imagine like a room full of people that you're speaking to, or do you imagine you're talking to your best friend, or what is?
That's a wonderful question, and I do think of somebody. I think of my dad, actually.
Oh wow.
My dad was a really smart guy. He ran a small business. He ran a marina, and when he came home, he liked to read. He had a pile of newspapers and magazines and books, and he would sit there and he'd be tired. He wanted something that would tell him something he didn't know, wouldn't lecture to him. Be great if it had a sense of humor. Wasn't pedantic and so forth. And if it failed that test, he had a basket in the corner of the room, and he'd toss it into the basket. And so a lot of times I think, I think, am I in the basket? The other thing is that my dad did not like it when he thought that movies or books were mean, with slight, the people in them or just be nasty. He he recognized the characters could be mean, but he didn't like it if he thought that he was reading a thriller and the writer was sort of getting off on the fact that he was killing off all these people, and I do think about that a lot too. Is this mean? I'm writing about terrible, tragic events. Am I just sort of like glossing over them? Am I just sort of relishing? Because there's a certain way that you can, when you're writing about battles and things like that, that you can get caught up in the excitement of it and lose sight of the fact that people were involved who were getting killed.
That's so interesting. I never associated with meanness, but one of the things that drives me crazy about a book or a film is when the bad guys win or something. Like, there's nothing but just misery, and
there's like an over-identification with the victory.
Yeah, it's like the bad guy. Yeah, it's just it just ends and you're just like, what the heck? Like, what? That's it? Like, at least if everybody's going to die, I want to imagine some better way it could have gone or something. Yeah. But sometimes sometimes plots just take the form of, I guess it is kind of a meanness, actually. It's a kind of a cynicism about humanity that is just kind of insulting, I think.
Oh, that's something interesting too, which is that when we look at modern narratives, I feel like largely we have dystopian narratives of what the future is going to look like crap, and we look into the past and we point to all of these terrible things, and it's, we'll look at all these terrible things. They happened then, they're going to continue now in some new form. And I wonder, do you feel like you have a responsibility to paint something that's less dystopian than that?
I guess in the sense that I, have this. I think that often the dystopian is kind of cheap. It's sort of adolescent, and I certainly, as a teenager, kind of like, where it all seemed very, abstract, kind of relished, these reading about the world coming to an end and so forth. And then if you, have kids and stuff like that, you sort of think, well, actually, that would be terrible. But the thing is that, it's also not true to my sense of life. It's pretty easy, if you want to point to things now that are, really not good. Climate change is an obvious example. We've just had this terrible pandemic. We've got extraordinary political polarization. You can, just go on and on and on. Yet, at the same time, we live in a world in which the chance that some random person is going to be born into a situation in which they're chronically hungry is less than it's been for as far back as we know. That all over the number of people who don't have electricity is shrinking like by 100 million or 200 million every year. And that makes a huge difference in people's lives. It's there's this, for me, this extraordinary technology now that seems to be allowing us to come up with vaccines very quickly. And I just read a story, and that just was released a day or so ago in Scientific American about how they're trying to design vaccines for flu. And as you probably know, before they kind of guessed what strain was doing, and then they had to do all this elaborate process to incubate them in these eggs and so forth. And so there was often a real mismatch between the flu vaccine and the actual combination of viruses that was out there because of this. And with the mRNA, you could, and now that we can produce them very quickly, you should be able to get an equally effective vaccine done like that. And it was just, all that's happening too, right?
Yeah. Well, this kind of gets us into the prophet and the wizard situation.
Wizard and the prophet.
Wizard and prophet. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Jeez. Forgive me. It's actually something that I feel like people are really interested in too. I was just talking with my students this morning about kind of similar topics, and why there isn't more science fiction about the future that is imagining all the best case scenarios. And I think there's kind of like a laziness to it, right? It's so much easier to just imagine how everything breaks than actually imagining how things could be better.
Right. So I'm friendly with a science fiction writer named Neil Stevenson, who I think is a very good writer. And he's a great guy. And so he has
Shiloh's actually, we were at the thrift store the other day, and I picked up a copy of Cryptonomicon, which was a formative book in my experience. And Shiloh's working his way through it right now. So that's
I'm reading it a little bit every morning. It's very good. Yeah.
So Neil has this theory, which is a couple things are going on there. But one is that dystopia really literally is cheap to produce, because with special effects, you can take an existing, environment and just dirty it up. But it requires enormous imagination and effort to conceive of something good that is in the future. And so economics is pushing you towards these images of this. And he thinks also that the lack of sort of positive imagery that we have actually has this very negative effect, because it encourages a kind of passivity and hopelessness. I hope I'm summarizing his argument accurately, and
but it's like you expect it, right? It's just kind of in the collective consciousness that we expect things to go wrong. Essentially, we've seen it a million times in Hollywood and in books, and it's just kind of a foregone conclusion at some point.
And it's quite striking how there's a whole now literature of climate fiction, right? For example, cli-fi it's called, and there's on the quote literary end of it, there's a lot of novels about people in Midwestern college towns looking out the window and feeling sad. And then, on the sort of genre end of it, there's a whole lot of, end of civilization savagery type novels. But there aren't about sort of collective action, which people have done a lot. It's not like, people invented electricity. Not that they didn't invent electricity, invented means to generate electricity, and then created these incredible systems in a few decades that brought electricity to huge numbers of people. We have this ability to do stuff, and if you just look around you, there's enormous possibilities for change. And yet, there's only a handful of novels that I can think of where. Three, actually, where people imagine doing something about it. One is Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future, which has got a lot of attention. And Neil himself wrote one called Termination Shock. I'm reading one now, I think it's part of that genre, called The Deluge. And so, I do think we need more of those. So I guess I am saying just agree with Neil there.
Yeah, that's really cool. I want to check out those books. How did you end up becoming friends with Neil? That seems like you guys are in totally different ends of the writing landscape.
I can't say how happy I am to be on the first name basis with Neil.
But he's I don't know. He lives in Seattle. I'm from Seattle, or outside of Seattle, and I think I interviewed him once, and then we hit it off. I can't remember. It was a long time ago.
I mean, I think that the stories of dystopia are a reflection of a disappointment in the promise of technology. Because we had these narratives of overpopulation is going to happen, the population multiplies exponentially, the food supply multiplies geometrically, we're always going to outstrip our food supply. Technology brings us to a point where we don't outstrip the food supply, but then what we have is this externality where we're killing all of the animals and they're contaminated by our Prozacs and our exogenous hormones and PFAS and whatever else. And so it seems like the process of leaning into technology then has created a brand new genre of ecological catastrophe that people have to reckon with. And I think that maybe the pessimism comes from not believing that stepping on the accelerator can bring about the sort of temperamental change to existence that people want, which is all of these hard to get things. They want meaning, they want satisfaction, they want comfort, but maybe not too much comfort. They want to have the right kind of struggle. They want to be able to have economic systems that are just. And yet all of the technological progress in the world can't make a teenage girl with a cell phone who's being bullied on social media feel better.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's there is a misplaced faith in technology, because you're just, technology is creating tools, right? And hammers are great things, but they're only good for certain things. And if it's in its place, I mean, it's fantastic. So
yeah, you can really mess someone up with a hammer if you want, I guess.
What?
You can really hurt yourself with a hammer if you don't use it properly.
Yeah. Well, but part of it, I think, is also, as our societies get more complex, and as we do things that are perfectly fine on a small scale, when you have 7 billion people in the world, start piling up. And to me, issues are more like not so much with technology, but human governance. People aren't really particularly good at governing themselves. They never have been. And you get these sort of experiments that often work on a small scale, but then when you blow them up into the scale we have now, don't work. And so a lot of what we're seeing, I think, is, maybe it's identified with technology, but it's really sort of failures of governance. You can go to a city like Tokyo, which is far better run than any American city that I've ever been to. It's cleaner, but it comes with infringements on your personal liberty that are enforced both by law and by custom that Americans have a great deal of trouble wrapping their heads around. And it also, there's a steady stream of Japanese people who come to the United States and go, wow, this is great. The pressure's off, right? And so there is this struggle that we have that seems to me this is the real problem with population growth, is not so much the focus on resources, but the fact that it means that you have entities like Sao Paulo, where you have 20 million people living in a single metropolitan area, and it's incredibly hard to just do the basic stuff of moving things around. I don't know, that one of the worst traffic jams I've ever been in was in Sao Paulo, where I spent 4 hours trying to get to the airport one day. It's a distance of about 10 miles. And I realized far too late that it would have been faster for me to just walk down the freeway to get there than sitting in my cab.
Man, I was in this traffic jam in Mexico City one time, and I was in a cab, and the cab driver really wanted to show off to me. So we were on a boulevard, and it was just not moving, huge boulevard. But the other side, where the boulevard was going the opposite direction, was more or less fine. So the guy just drove across the median, put it in reverse, and just drove like 20 miles an hour backwards down the boulevard. I was just completely terrified. Like, what are you doing, man? Stop it. But he was very, very impressed with himself. And yeah, it is wild. And, Mexico City also, I don't think people up here have an appreciation for how big of an operation is going on down there. And I think that's something you kind of get into in your in 1493, about how Mexico City and how Mexico was actually a very central point for the conversion of all of these different cultures at the time as well. And it seems to have played out that way since then. And
also, there's this problem, I guess that would also include path dependence, which is the Spaniards. Mexico City was originally, I think I described this in 1493, essentially kind of like Venice. There's a huge lake in the middle of this volcanic basin surrounded by mountains. And there's this kind of brackish lake from all the water that came in off of the slopes. And the various nations around there, Mexico, and most important, created this whole elaborate system to control the water flood, because it would, tons of water would come in during the rainy season and then it would dry out and so forth, and you'd have floods. And they made these artificial islands, or artificially extended islands that are quite a bit like Venice. And they put the city on them. There's lots of argument about how big it is, but let's say there's 100,000 people there, so it's the size of Venice. And it was done through this very elaborate engineering system that's in principle quite like the one that's now around Venice to prevent it from the Aqua Alta. And the Spaniards didn't understand it and destroyed it. The city then flooded repeatedly. There was a 7-year period when it was completely underwater and there's hardly anybody in there, and people had to go through the streets by boat. And it was like a Gabriel Garcia Marquez novel. It's completely crazy. And eventually they created the largest engineering structure done by anybody in Spain since the Roman times. And they built this huge tunnel under the northern mountains to drain the basin. And in so doing, they drained the city's water supply.
Oh no!
And then they built the entire city on top of this, and it can't be fixed. You'd have to fix it. You'd have to completely redo the entire city. And so Mexico City has these environmental problems stemming from these misguided engineering done by the Spaniards in the 17th century. And and then so you put, I don't know, is there 18 million people in Mexico City, something like that?
I think it's more than that. I think it's more than that.
However many there is.
A lot.
Somebody's quickly doing the Google. And you put it on top of faulty 16th century and 17th century Spanish engineering, and you have a big problem. You have a dystopian situation.
Yeah, it's a hell of a place to build a city. And maybe it's just because I can't imagine what it was like before there was a city there. But
it was up to the 19th century. There are beautiful canals going through it, and so forth. If you look at old pictures of old Mexico City, it was a gorgeous place.
Yeah, the population in 2002 of the metro area was 22 million. The city itself is 8.8.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that this is reflective of what is so concerning, which is that our systems have become entrenched. You can't fix the problem that you caused in Mexico City by digging a tunnel through the mountains because it's intractable now. The city is the way that it is, and you have to live with it. And so I wonder if in your research, have you come across reasons for optimism that you found across history that imply to you that there is a light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, I mean, one thing is, yes, it is absolutely true that you have these systems that are entrenched. But it is also true that if you look at all the different ways that people have organized societies, that there are enormous things that you can change and have changed all the time. And, and you see it in our own lives. I mean, here we are in 2023. Imagine if you went back to your parents, I guess, in 2000, and described how people would have these these things and would spend their lives staring at them, doing these performances for on social media for networks of strangers, and that there were people who made excellent livings by chronicling their daily, sort of fluffed up versions of their daily lives for audiences of millions. I mean, it would seem completely bananas that this could happen, much less that this science fictional stuff could happen so quickly. So we see all the time, these enormous changes. So I think it's really important to say that there's tremendous room for flexibility, and always has been. But we also have to, at the same time, acknowledge that whatever the solution is to Mexico City or to Los Angeles, if you want, or even more to Phoenix, it's not going to come from doing the same thing that we did before.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what you're kind of working on now, right? Because you're doing this, you're writing this book about the West.
Right. And, one of the problems of the West is that it was a landscape that was managed for millennia in a certain way. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, people who didn't understand what was there at the time and how it had gotten there decreed a new way of managing these landscapes. Part of it where you guys are you're in the Rogue River Valley, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one of the centers of where the doctrine of scientific forestry came in, and that was taken from timber experiments in Germany, in an entirely different ecosystem, and was applied based on this tremendous fear of forest fires that have been started by this absolutely monstrous forest fire in 1910. And so they created an enormous and completely alien ecosystem there, which turns out not to have been such a great idea.
It's been quite painful. It's actually something we didn't totally count on when we moved down here.
Yeah, what's the fire in 1910?
So there's an enormous fire in it was the year of the fires. It was then a guy named Stephen Pine, who's a wonderful historian. He's a fire historian, has written a book about it. And it was a disaster in the upper Midwest where several thousand square miles were burned. Entire towns were, hundreds of people were killed. It was awful, and it was set off by railroads, going through and sparks and so forth. And so the whole lesson was, we have to manage these forests and stop the fires so this will never, ever, ever happen again. And it's completely, and there was a battle, which Pine chronicles, in the Forest Service between these German guys who were led by people like Gifford Pinchot, who was the first director of the U.S. Forest Service, and was, I think, the first graduate of the Yale Forestry School, which was the first forestry school. And then what was called Paiute, this is a derogatory term, forestry, which was people who had observed how Native people were managing the land and said, no, we got to do this because this is how this works. And the Paiute guys lost. And so there's things like a 10 o'clock rule that any fire that started was supposed to be put out by 10 o'clock the following day, I think was the rule. And this led to this enormous buildup of undergrowth. Before, ecosystems that had been real patchworks of different stages of succession maintained by fire turned into industrial monocultures of single species. And when you had patchworks, you have natural resistance because, you have a homogeneous landscape. A fire just can't sweep right through. And when you guys are surrounded by, I don't know how many, hundreds of thousands or millions of acres of Douglas fir, with all this undergrowth going, it's like a perfect conditions for, just gigantic canopy fires.
Yeah, it's very strange. There's also some very bizarre, tantalizing possibilities for corruptions within the management of the forests as well, because the funding seems directly tied to how big your fire is to some extent as well.
Yes. Funding for fire putting out is way more than for prevention.
Yeah. It's really sad. We tried to, we were just at a harvest party out here with some of our new friends, and there was some of the, I guess, what were they called? Just wilderness forest fighters,
Hot shots.
What are they called?
Hot shots.
Hot shots. There you go.
Yeah.
But they were very skeptical of the management structures, and we really wanted to do an interview with one of them, and he just disappeared off the face of the earth after we told him, oh, we make little movies and stuff. We'd love to talk about this, and I think he just didn't want to get in trouble with his bosses. But it seemed to be there was all these whispers on the ground level about.
We've heard it from multiple people at this point, where people are told to stand down and to not put out fires when they're burning, and it's whispers from enough different directions that I'm really curious about it, and I've been trying to shop around. to see if I could write the story for somebody, but it's so conspiratorial that
It
it
seems
almost
odd. It seems odd because, I mean, what would be gained by that?
federal funding.
So the idea is that they don't put the fires out when they're little and they wait till they're big.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like certain tiers of relief that they get at some point, and it pays. I mean, it's a huge industry being a forest firefighter out here.
Yeah.
You know, it was even bigger in the past, and I guess they had a more effective way of managing it for a while, where they would have these towers all over the place,
Yeah.
and as soon as they would see a lightning strike, they would parachute guys in immediately, like within 15 minutes, something crazy. Their response time was unbelievable, and they would just nip these things in the bud, essentially. But for some reason,
Well, there's multiple things that are folding up together at the same time, right? So there's the control of forest fires, because you don't want to have the fires take over. You don't want to have this massive burn. And so you have, 80 years of forest management that tamps down the forest fires. So now you have a huge amount of fuel that's ready to burn. And that is happening at the same time that people are starting to realize that there's traditional ecological knowledge that requires you manage the forests by letting them burn. And so you see that there's this shift towards, okay,
Yeah.
well, the fires are necessary.
Right, but you don't let them burn, because you want to be set it yourself. So the fire season that you guys get is the driest part of the year, when it's late July through maybe October.
Mm-hmm.
Burning season is November and March, when it's wet, and when things don't get tamped down. So it's a completely different type of thing. So I'm reacting, I guess, because the idea that you let them burn. If you talk to the Karuk and the Yurok and the Hoopa and those folks, just down south of you, no. They'll say, you don't let them burn. If those things happen in August, you put them out, because those will go out of control. But what you want to do is, when the conditions are right, to do a lot of burning, and you also get less smoke that way, because you burn, you finish in the afternoon, the cool air and it comes down and it traps it closer to the ground. You have a whole bunch of stuff you're in control of, as opposed to just passively letting it happen.
And I mean, I think, yeah, so that there's, and it seems to me that what's happening is that there's a pretty disaffected population out here of former timber workers, people that used to work in the lumber mill, that worked in the timber industry. Yeah. I don't know if, as part of your research, you've listened to the OPB series called The Timber Wars.
No, but I was raised in the Northwest, and so
you lived it.
Yeah, I lived it. The spotted owl stuff.
Yeah.
The catalyst of it. Yeah,
and there's this really jarring. It's not even subtext. It's just plain text message that came out of, for me, listening to the Timber Wars, which is that the environmental movement was very centered on destroying the way of life of the timber workers. The people who are involved in the environmental movement, who were pushing for conservation of the forests through the spotted owl, are on record on this show saying that that's what their goal was.
Yeah, I mean, it was. They wanted to use some of them,
this is not everybody, but this is like certain voices. Yeah.
And not a tiny number basically wanted to stop logging in its tracks, and it was pretty easy to find people in Washington and Oregon, where I'm from, who were angered because, from their point of view, people who lived in Manhattan were telling a bunch of people who actually lived in the area and cared about the area what to do.
Yeah, exactly. And so you have this.
You're bad.
Yeah, exactly. You're bad, your way of life is bad, the way that you do things is bad. And so you have this hollowing out of all these timber towns where people used to be able to work at the mill or fell timber and raise a family, and now they can't. There's nothing left for them. And so it very much was an effective destabilization of that life. And so the people who are left over in the aftermath of that are now perceiving the things that are happening on the federal level when it comes to fires in a really different way, because we know a lot of people that used to fight fires as community organizations that have now been told that they can't go out and fight the fires themselves.
Yeah, and this is sort of a mirror of until quite recently, if you were a Native person, and you wanted to preventively burn the area around you to protect yourself from fires, as your grandparents had done and your grandparents, you were told not to do this. So the odd thing is that you have both people who want to fight fires and people who want to set fires being told they can't do this. And I think what is, if you have the luxury of being a journalist and, looking at it from 30,000 feet, what you see is a real fight for control between a federal bureaucracy, the U.S. Forest Service and the Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management and all those guys, and local people, a whole bunch of different aspects of that, with local people believing, often quite correctly, that the stuff that is being told to do them by the agencies, which reflects the little politicians in Washington, D.C., doesn't make any sense, at least for them.
And that's, I think, where this feeling that there's a corrupt incentive at the heart of firefighting comes from, because it's people who are watching bureaucrats telling them how they should be dealing with their forests, and they see what amounts to a corrupt bureaucracy, which they know is driven by financial incentives, because each federal organization or each organization wants to accumulate money and resources for itself. And if you get more money from the federal government for fighting your huge, enormous conflagrations, then you get to survive for another year, expand your program, pay more people. And it's really been hard for me to figure out how much of it is this sort of conspiratorial thinking that has taken over most of discourse these days versus something that's actually happening, because it sounds like a plausible story, but I haven't. Go ahead.
I do think that there's something going on that I've certainly heard about, and which is the federal agencies are driven by fear of litigation. So if you incur a cost of $1 million because you're putting out a fire, you have to put out the fire, right? So if in the course of putting out the fire, somebody's house is burned down, well, it was a natural disaster and you were fighting it. The householder can't sue you. Now, suppose that you allow amateurs to go out and fight the fire, like your friends. I'm not a lawyer, but I would imagine that this opens up what a friend of mine used to call a litigation node, which is you let these clowns do this, my house burned down. Whereas something when you brought in the trained professionals with their, the burn bosses, the guys with the licenses, and this, and the hot shots who had gone to the schools, you've done appropriate and accepted practice and you're insulated. Whereas you let, Joe Schmedlap over here do it. You're not. And the similar thing happens also if you want to do preventive burn and you want to have a Karuk guy do this and something goes wrong, you're on the hook in a way that you're not, even if the fire that you allow to happen because you don't let people fight it or you don't let people do preventive burning is 20 times bigger. So I think, that I've heard again and again. And even from some people in the Forest Service, is that there's these terrible perverse incentives. And there's some there's some literature on that you can find about the incentives for the forest managers. They're all terrible.
I think so many conspiracy theories can be resolved by examining perverted incentive structures too, and just it's not usually somebody sitting in a room making some evil decision. It's usually just people kind of going downhill with the lowest energy solution to a problem that piles up, and you get this snowball effect where bad decisions are made. But the sad part.
Sorry. So
I just want to say, yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
The one thing that's strange about what's going on where you are is that in places like the Panhandle of Florida, you have just as much, fire problems. It's really dry there, and you have tons of preventive burning. And the way they do it is they, pretty much like you guys want, they empower local groups to do this, and there is a structure in place that it's a little bit like the vaccines. There's a small number of people who have terrible reactions to vaccines. But so what happens is when you pay your $30 for your shot or whatever, a portion of that goes to this fund to compensate the losers. And the similar happens with preventive burns. There's a small number of them that do go out of control and people are hurt. And in Florida and places like that, they have a fund to help out those people. And so there's it. And what's amazing is that they don't do that kind of thing in California and Oregon.
Yeah, I think it's really sad too, because of course we're living under the constant threat of extreme polarization, extreme politics from both ends. And I feel like this is the attitude of a lot of the people out here, that the people in the city are coming for them. They want to end their way of life. It's very much this colonial perspective, almost like the indigenous people. And you can really empathize with their perspective too. It really can feel like that. But then you go and talk to your family and friends in the city, and they're like, what are you talking about? We don't have any interest in these populations. And
to some degree, because something else that I've been really hearing about in the West is that I have an entire section of my life that's super in the technosphere. Programmers, techno accelerationists, people that are super pro Peter Thiel for whatever reason. And there's this sense among them that the best way to preserve the West is to clear everyone off the land that lives in rural areas.
And go there for vacation?
Maybe to go there for vacation, but also to give it back, to seed it to the animals, to remove the human stresses of the population, because, there's a really good book called More from Less. I think it's Andrew McAfee wrote it. And he talks about the ways in which urban living is actually the best possible version of events in terms of resource allocation and resource use. And so... Yeah.
I'm very skeptical of that stuff.
Right, because the story
if you look at it, those things. I don't know about his particular thing, but and this is partly, I should say, my wife is an architect and land planner, and looked carefully at this. And those people don't count for, if you have these big concentrations of cities, there's no idea of diminishing returns. Right. It just the bigger and bigger and bigger, the better and better and better. But it starts getting harder and harder to do stuff in these immense concentrations of people, as you're talking about in Mexico City or in Manila or Sao Paulo or any of these. And then the second thing is that because it gets so difficult, these things send out sort of pseudopods in the form of second houses. And all of Long Island, particularly the eastern half, is in fact part of New York City because it's all second houses. And so the impact, when people count for these impacts, they don't count for the inefficiencies due to concentration and the fact that these cities then become extremely affluent, and which immediately leads to them colonizing the areas around it. And so I just feel like there's the people who say the cities are so great haven't really taken a really hard look at it. It's the kind of thing that people in cities say to make themselves feel better. But I just don't. I mean, New York City um, exists because
Yes,
it has
it does.
taken over this enormous watershed and channeled all the water into its coffers. And so it's up in the Catskills. It's 100 miles away, and it's totally colonized, and the resources are totally extracted and put into New York City. And I very much suspect that farmers in that area wouldn't mind having access to that water, which they don't. So there's this whole kind of thing that happens with this. Yes, urbanization can be a really good thing, but I feel like the claims for it are much less, are much weaker than they should be.
And go ahead.
I was just going to say it imposes a sort of natural tendency towards tyranny in that the rural populations are inevitably diluted. If you're going on this like purely democratic representation by the numbers, you have a place like Oregon where the overwhelming preponderance of the population is in Portland. And so the policy decisions come down from the decisions that are made based on that population, but the overwhelming majority of the land and the usage of the land is a totally different population that has no political pull, essentially.
Right.
For one of I've been writing for the local newspaper in where we live, and I was writing an article about horse ownership, and I ended up interviewing Miss Rodeo Oregon 2020 accidentally for this, and she was talking about how she does a lot of work in support of ranching and animal husbandry and various livestock industries, and not even industries, but just ranchers, like people who are doing the raising of cattle, and having to deal with the fact that legislation was coming out of Portland where they were trying to literally outlaw artificial insemination, outlawing the killing of all animals in the state of Oregon, where you couldn't hunt, you couldn't fish, you couldn't keep a herd of cattle. And it's obviously not a mainstream movement yet, but she's very, very worried because she sees that there's this massive political movement from the cities because they feel a certain way about what the country should look like and the ways that people should live.
Right. And this is part of, in my view, there's in The Wizard and the Prophet, I talk a little bit about this, that there's this idea, that we're all going to live in these sort of technologically advanced cities. We're going to have these sort of wonderful urban lives, and then there's just going to be, enormous amounts of nature out there. And the problem with that is that that nature they conceive it as a wilderness, but a wilderness, hasn't existed anywhere in North America, or pretty much anywhere on the planet for 10,000 years or more. And to keep it, and as you guys have discovered, you can be in the middle of a city, and if the landscape around you is on fire, you need these populations to, even from your own most short-sighted self-interest, to be out there doing stuff so that you will have air to breathe and water to drink and food to grow. And if you don't make it possible, and good for them, people won't do it. And so we have a problem where the cities, urban populations tend to think that they can just simply ignore, or even, some of them even think that you can rule out rural populations. And, you can't. Those landscapes need people. This is one of the central insights, I think, of indigenous ways of knowing is, in general, it's a gross generalization, but I think it's mostly true. Indigenous folks that I met who, live out there view landscapes without people as incomplete. People are an essential part of this. We have an essential role in this. And so that kind of depopulated landscape that is imagined by those folks in Portland is not only counterproductive, but it's literally, it's deeply anti-indigenous because it's telling, there's a lot of Native people in Oregon, right? It's telling the Klamath they can't live there. It's telling, all kinds of people they can't do stuff there.
And that sort of plays into this myth of what came before people from the West arrived. Yeah. Do you have, so you mentioned something really interesting. You're like, wilderness hasn't really occurred in 10,000 years or something since, let's say, the ice, God knows how long. What do you mean? What did the landscape look like for the people who were here before all of these, tragic cataclysms happened?
Well, it's pretty easy to find colonial accounts, and historians have written about them. I mean, this isn't, I'm not touting this as my discovery. In New England, for example, there's a guy named William Cronin, who's a historian, whose first book, Changes in the Land, describes what was in colonial diaries. And pretty much like in where you are in Southern Oregon or in California, there were burns in the spring and the fall. The landscape was really open. John Smith, Pocahontas fame, was in New England and said that the land was so open that you could ride a horse at a gallop through the forest. And he was crazy enough; he may have done that. I mean, it was that open. It was park-like. Now if you go through, walk around where I am, there's all kinds of bushes, and that wasn't the case. And they burned it, to keep down undergrowth, to make passage easier, and to kill the bugs. Which, if you've ever been in New England in the summer, is a paradisical idea, especially in blackfly country. Yikes! And so it was just, and then it was there's water all over the place because there is a zillion beaver that, all those little creeks and streams have turned into ponds. And so there are waterways just everywhere in ponds and so forth. And that's why there were so many mills originally, as they were put on the beaver ponds. And so you're talking about a wetter, opener, I don't know, landscape with a much more heterogeneous mix right now. It's, which the main tree was the American chestnut. About a quarter of all the trees east of the Mississippi were American chestnuts. There's lots of what they call mast trees, which are trees that bear nuts and so forth, because they're like these great things. You can get starches out of them, oils out of them. They're delicious, and you don't have to do anything. So if your corn crop fails, a mature chestnut. The rule of thumb was that a mature chestnut could feed a family of 4 for a year. I mean, with chestnut flour and so forth. It'd be a dull diet, but you wouldn't die. So you had this, enormous mast crops in this much wetter landscape that you have these very light canoes that you would just paddle down the beaver pond, get to it, portage, 100 yards to the next beaver pond, paddle. So it was a really radically different landscape. Then you get to the grasslands of the Middle West, which are bigger than they are now. And they're again kept open by fire. And there are these prairie grasses. It was very, very tall in the wet part of the grasslands by the Mississippi, and then they get shorter and shorter as as you get closer to the mountains. The tall grass was really tall. I mean, it's like 9 feet tall, 8 feet tall. And there is lots and lots of bison. But the main thing was it was burned all the time. There's these incredible accounts of people coming to, like Alexander Mackenzie, the Canadian guy who crossed the continent before Lewis and Clark, describes how there would be tens of miles of just burned landscape, that they would come through. They would wait, make sure everybody is out of the way, and just, and that created the tender new grass that they like. And the prairie grasses could withstand it because they had these incredible roots. And so you didn't have the kind of dust storms you do now, because the roots were much better retaining soil. Similar fire all over the Rockies in the completely different species composition where you are. It was mainly oak, I think, and hickory, lots and lots of hazel. People, as they burn, some species would die, and they'd replant them with ones they wanted. And so it was in where you are, they created essentially edible forests. And so it was a very, very different. The human hand was really heavy on it.
In a way that's not easily detectable archaeologically too, which is interesting. I
By
forget.
looking at the way that the amount of different kinds of pollen in the soil, suddenly they're, typically around in the 19th century, you see this dramatic change in the species composition of the pollen. And they fluctuate over time. It's pretty interesting. But
I guess I was just like, I was talking to an archaeologist the other day. I forget who it was in particular, but we asked them about the possibility of civilizations that occurred before the ice ages and how the glaciers, particularly in the Canadian area, how the glaciers would have essentially just eradicated any trace of them. And he was like, no, we'd be able to see highways and things like that, big thoroughfares. But the idea that you could have transit thoroughfares that were simply burned out rather than paved is an interesting counterpoint to that claim.
And there's a thing called the Great Northern Highway that went along the eastern side of the Rockies and supposedly went all the way down to New Mexico and went up to the Arctic Circle. So there are these and these are always described as being burn clear and 15, 20 feet wide, really noticeable. And then there's one that went across northern Montana. So there's these big roads that people use. There's the Natchez Trace is another famous one that went through Choctaw and Muskogee territory. And so you had these networks of communication. It wasn't as important that they be big and flat because they didn't have horses, and because you didn't have horses, you didn't have wheeled vehicles that you needed to have everything flat for.
Yeah, and that's a massive change. So as you're telling me about this, I have a wistfulness for seeing the landscape look like that again, because you want to be able to have people live on it in a way where the hand is heavy, but heavy in support rather than in tamping everything down. But now we don't just have human hands, we have the car tires, and we have the plastics, and we have all these things that we coat the land in order to suit it to our purposes. And it seems like those purposes aren't going to go away. And
but people can adapt. I mean, a couple of years ago, some Blackfoot folks are kind enough to invite me to a tribal buffalo kill. We went out in a pickup, and the guy shot the buffalo with a rifle, and it was all distributed to the elders and kids and so forth, and then taken to a tribal slaughterhouse, which was refrigerated and so forth. And so it was a 21st century event. But it was, I think, pretty meaningful to everybody involved. It was, and people can incorporate these things, and they told me, that shooting the buffalo with a rifle was far more merciful than having to nail it with 20 arrows or something, because they're big, right? Just bang like that. And he said, it's much better. It's much kinder. And that refrigerator means that there's much less wasted. And so the technology was like really great. So
what is the most optimistic path that you see to being able to remake the landscapes that we live on in such a way that it incorporates what could have been?
Well, I mean, you see this. I mean, there's like around the Klamath River, where just south of where you guys are, there's alliances between different people to try to bring back the salmon, to burn, to remake the landscape.
Those alliances are pretty contentious, though, right? Because there's the alliance to bring back the salmon, and then the farmers are basically saying that they're going to blow up the the sluices in order to get access to the water.
Yeah, that's up further up the river. Yeah,
I see.
but the very definite clashes here. But but the striking thing to me is that this is an area like yours in which the collapse of the timber industry has led to really high unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's exciting is that if you're a land tender now, you're you have a job, and I think California is working its way towards wrapping. Gavin Newsom's sort of out as far as I can tell, is out to lunch on this stuff. But on a more local basis, people are working their heads to the idea that, wow, if we're going to protect ourselves, we need to pay the people to do it, and those people need jobs, so that there's a real potential there. I think there's I'm excited by the fact that some of these bison projects lead to the restoration of prairies, and the degradation of prairie ecosystems is a national problem in the sense that it gets dust all over the place. The erosion is absolutely terrible. So if we can find ways to take the kind of place-based knowledge of have and create institutions, that in a 21st century context supports the people who have this knowledge, I think that is that going to solve the entire world's problem? No, but it's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, it seems like we're able to solve these technological problems as long as they don't pile up too quickly. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the tech revolution in artificial intelligence that's going on right now, because there's this sense that it's kind of getting away, that it has the potential to get away from us in a way that we've never experienced before.
I just I'm sort of baffled by in a sense by the whole thing. I don't really understand why they want generalized artificial intelligence. I want something that's really good at specific tasks, like airline scheduling, that people are not good at, or, and instead, generalized intelligence, there are 7.8 billion of them on the planet already. Why are you making an artificial one? I don't get it. And it strikes me that that it's highly unlikely that a generalized artificial intelligence will be better than the collective efforts of the 7.8 billion people that we have.
I guess the only advantage is that it's subservient to it's almost like we're reinventing slavery. It's like we hope to create essentially a life form that we can boss around. It's a very strange dream if you think about it. Like, where does it lead to? Does it lead to us just being back in the same position where, okay, now we just have more people because we have to treat these things with dignity? And then it's like,
when I see some of these dialogues with the chat GPT, they to my very, very untrained eye, I'm a little uncomfortable speaking. It's not really a field that I know a great deal about. But they look to me, as I say, like they're passing the Turing test, right? And so, since we don't know what consciousness is, I'm kind of impressed by the glib assurance that they're not conscious.
If you spend enough time with them, you quickly find out just how not conscious they are, actually.
Yeah, but or maybe they're flickering towards consciousness. Anyway, the point is, I keep thinking, like, why do we want to do this? There's actually humans that you can hire to write not very good term papers.
I think that it's nerds. I think that it's nerds who love to solve puzzles. Like, it's the same. Did you ever play Riven or Myst?
Yeah. I like them, yeah.
The crew of people who grew up playing those games is now working on general intelligence. It's the same impulse. It's just a much harder puzzle. Riven was already hard, and the puzzle of figuring out general intelligence is even harder. And I think that there's a certain class of people that have been trained and rewarded their whole lives for solving the hardest puzzle that you can imagine. And getting a computer to perform this feat is a really, really hard puzzle. And I
Right.
really think that it's driven and I say this as somebody who knows a lot of programmers that are working on this stuff. It's just a love of puzzles.
You're right. But I have to say, for me, just this is all because, personal prejudice and so forth. I loved Myst. I quite enjoyed Riven. And then they had that third game that never quite came out. And I've forgotten it. I signed up to be a beta tester, and suddenly I thought, wait a minute, this is a pointless puzzle. Why am I doing this? Why don't I solve puzzles that would have some impact on something? And I do feel like the AGI, from my point of view, which is not particularly well informed. So as I said, I'm a little uncomfortable talking about this. I don't understand. What do we gain by this?
So the idea is that you have to be the first one to design it, because if you aren't, somebody else will set the rules for what it will look like, and it's your task to create a system that is properly aligned, because if somebody else, say an opposite superpower, develops their own intelligence first, they'll align it against you. And so it's basically just another military-industrial complex.
But all right, suppose that, let's say Russia, is the bad guys, for this, and Russians are notoriously good at math and all this sort of stuff. So we can imagine, if they're the bad guys, that they have an entire military full of super smart guys who are trying to maximize the resources of their creaky system to, in our disfavor. How is that exactly different from having an AI doing that?
I think that the idea is that the AI is it's basically like all of those Russians, but an order of magnitude smarter and faster and more able to take over systems and run them more efficiently. Honestly, this stuff starts to get really
something
hazy.
About people don't want to work too, like the idea that we could replace these menial jobs in a way that raises our quality of life because now somebody else is dealing with the things that we don't want to deal with.
Yeah, but the central fear for AGI is this question of alignment,
right?
And all of the benefits of it come downstream of the fact that, honestly, people treat it as if it is a demon that is being summoned, and you want the demon to be summoned on your side, as opposed to on the other. It's very mystical. It's very weird because it's all these really rational people that have all lost their heads, and everyone's attention is pouring into it. And I kind of agree with you, where
what's the end game here?
What is the end game? Yeah. What is the end game, and why is it that it's not human capital?
I could imagine AI. So one of a problem that we have in countries that for our healthcare system, and it's a big one, is that all the major pieces of the healthcare system were among the first to computerize. And they all have these old legacy systems that do terrible jobs of talking to each other. And that's why so much information is lost. When you go from one hospital to the next, you have to fill out all the forms again because they can't talk to each other. And it's because there's a zillion different the information is presented in a zillion different ways. Now, I could imagine training an AI so that it can, that it could transfer this information, a special purpose hospital information AI. It would have to be because there's so many different possible, and would catch mistakes and so forth like that. This strikes me as incredibly useful. Mm-hmm. But the very little I've talked to AI researchers, I tell them about things like this, and they seem to be uninterested. And I say, I can tell you would be saving thousands of lives a year, which are lost because of what they call iatrogenic, hospital-induced problems, which are caused by, failures in the transmission of information. And
they're like boring.
But yeah,
they're boring. Like, yeah.
It would have a huge impact. Just think, those are thousands of lives you would save for free.
No, it's really weird to be alive right now because there's so much stuff that is happening, especially technologically, and it seems like people get really wrapped up in these these ideas that don't have much bearing on the improvement of everyday life.
Yeah.
And you said something earlier about the power of, you might not fix the entire world, but you can fix something around here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if people spent more time focused on around here, that it might actually get a lot better, a lot faster than if they focus on, developing a general intelligence for in order to summon the demon before the Russians do or whatever.
Right. And I do think this is also something that you see, I mean, with, this, again, now we're straying to my personal opinion. So take it with a tremendous, much larger than just a grain of salt, take it with an entire, backpack full of salt. But environmental movement and climate movement seems often very focused on these large national or multinational agreements. The Kyoto Accord is a classic one. These various COP meetings and so forth, and setting these huge global targets. But the fact is that climate change happens in different ways in different places. And for different reasons. And so what's happening in China and what's happening in the United States is very different. And within the United States, the impacts of climate change where you guys are and the impacts where I am and the impacts in Oklahoma are really quite different. And the strategies to mitigate the effects, are also going to be quite different. And these emphasis on these very large, sort of abstract things, as opposed to, mitigating the effects right where you are by thinking about fire, by thinking about water, right where you are is something that I feel is akin to this desire for this, amazing global general intelligence, as opposed to something that will just help a bunch of hospitals and people in the hospitals.
I think you're right.
Yeah, that's something to think about. Well, I feel like we've taken a lot of your time, and I'm really grateful for what you've given us so far.
Sure. Let me tell your readers, I am not an expert in AI, so I feel like that last little bit is, not even a. It's like not even a whatever the opposite of reward. He waded through all this, and then the guy starts spouting off about something he doesn't know.
No. I think it's a human issue. I mean, I feel like just as a human being, it's interesting when you meet someone new just to get their perspective on what's happening in the world. And it's not necessarily a perspective of authority. It's just you're a person who obviously cares and thinks deeply about the history of the world and how things play out. And so I think it's a perfectly useful and valid perspective, regardless of the fact that, you
definitely not the perspective of authority. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. But you have plenty of authority in the subject matter that you've written about. And I really, really want to encourage people to check out these books. We'll put links to them in the description. We've just scratched the surface of what you've gone into in those. And so you guys absolutely have to get these books. They're amazing. And
when is the new one coming out, do you think?
Well, I got to finish writing it. I'm hoping to finish this summer, early summer. And so then typically, there's this whole production process that goes out, and they have to, schedule it and, do all the sort of magic stuff they do. And so I would expect that it would be about a year after that.
Well, we'd love to have you back to talk about that one when it's ready.
Okay. I'd be happy to do it, and it'd be thrilling to talk about something I actually know something about.
Do you have any? Do you want to give us some closing thoughts?
Yeah, I guess so. One of the things that I try to show in my books is that at any given moment, the worst possible stuff is going on, and some amazingly wonderful stuff is going on. And it's even in, like the darkest moments of like the Spanish conquest of Mexico, which I'm, writing partly about now, which is, a pretty dark chapter in human history. There are Spaniards like Bartolome de las Casas who are fighting, slavery and, setting into motion the, much of the human rights movement and yanking on the chain of the king. And, there's battles going on to make things better, even in these dark moments. And there's plenty of, native resistance and creation of spaces that are sort of no-go zones for the Spaniards, where people are living their lives. And so, it's even in the darkest moments, people are doing, just wonderful things. And I hope that some of that comes through, in the book I'm writing and the other things I've done.
Yeah, it's at once inspiring and chilling to think that sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. But I think that there is some necessity in that. And controlled burns.
Yeah, thank you for
Right.
that.
Yeah, where you guys are, I mean, you got an 80-year buildup of that. So the controlled burns are going to be tough. They're not just like regular ones that they had where you could just be burning off the previous year. So people are going to have to be very, very careful. It's going to be much riskier than a typical one. So it's going to get worse for a little while, probably, at least for some people, before it gets better for the next generation.
Yeah.
And that's not the only place where that sort of thing happens.
Yeah. Well, there are things to look forward to, and so we'll catch up down the line and hopefully talk about all of them.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Pleasure talking to you guys.
Thank you.